Hey everyone, Daniel here. Welcome to our final study session on Engels' Anti-Dühring with Professor Landon Frim. I think you all know Landon by now, and today we're talking about the final section of the book, section 3, entitled Socialism. So it was a great read. I shared, I did share Paul Blackledge's secondary kind of work, specifically his essay on philosophy and Engels and on Anti-Dühring. If you haven't read that yet, I do recommend taking a look at that. I found it quite useful, and also interesting that he made a connection which I didn't know about, which is that when Luxemburg came up with the famous phrase "socialism or barbarism," she was actually it was a direct reference to Anti-Dühring, and I thought that was interesting. Anyways, Landon, please take it away.
Okay, thanks. Let me just very briefly put into the chat here, as per usual, the link to my website, and specifically, let me get it back here. Specifically, the bit where I have prepared by theme the sections of part 3 of Anti-Dühring that we're going to be discussing today. If you follow that link right there and go to the website and scroll down, okay, it's listed as part 3. Sorry, it's not listed as part 3. Bad formatting on my part. But it's the one that starts with A, reason in bourgeois society, moving through B, utopian socialists, C, historical materialism, D, contradictions of capitalism, E, technology, expansion and crisis, F, state and class under socialism, G, division of labor, especially division of town and country as well, H, Dühring's reformist commune, I, money, J, value and compensation under socialism, J, value and compensation under socialism, and K, religion and family. That's a lot. That's a lot to cover today. And, we won't be doing each of these sections ad nauseum, but because this is the last time we're going to be together discussing this book, I thought it would be important at least to discuss some of these like incredibly important topics. Again, up until, the publishing and circulation of Marx's Capital, Engels' Anti-Dühring was like the definitive statement in terms of the Marxian worldview. Okay. And it's especially notable because there is this reluctance amongst both Marx and Engels to talk about what a future socialism would look like. And you get that in part 3 of Anti-Dühring as well. But there's a little bit more of a willingness to tip the hand a little bit, to make, if not prophetic statements, at least take some conceptual leaps and guesses as to what a future society will look like. And this is true to form in this book. Part of the polemical strategy, right? So in trying to talk about why Eugen Dühring's, what he pompously calls his socialitarian commune, okay, because he has to make a neologism for everything, in order to contrast what the Marxian future socialist society will look like to Dühring's own vision, right? He is willing to make some kinds of claims about what the future will look like in terms of the family, in terms of ecology, in terms of money and pay and salary, compensation, people's status in society, and the working day. Okay, and that's why I really like reading part 3. The way we opened up this series, okay, was that at least from an unreformed rationalist philosopher's perspective, part 1 is breathtaking, but the most problematic, most frustrating, making all sorts of statements about how, we definitely don't need to do a theory of being or a theory of reality. We definitely don't need to do any kind of robust metaphysics. Yes, we need to do a sort of epistemology, but the epistemology is kind of, quasi-pragmatic without being pragmatist, or quasi-empirical without being empiricist. It's rather woolly, and I think rather too humble, at least compared to a full-blown rationalism, even as it praises rationalists like Descartes and Spinoza as, quote, dialectical thinkers. Very problematic, but very woolly. um, through part 2, which gets a little bit more nuts and bolts, a little bit more approachable, talking about, historical materialism, dialectics, how capitalist political economy works. Okay, and part 3 is really the fireworks. Okay, and that's what, I'm very pleased to be discussing today. Part 3, we have a little bit of a holdover from this earlier 2 discussions, especially, this first section, I'm going to talk about reason in bourgeois society. We have a little bit of a repetition about his claims about why so-called eternal reason and philosophy aren't where it's at, and what we need is a materialist, really economic appreciation of society to see where things are going. Okay, but then there's this great leap beyond where he talks about how and why a socialist system can and should be built, and what that system is actually going to look like. So here's my plan for today, if you're amenable. I'd like to just sort of run through, put grist for the mill. I'd like to sort of run through the basic ideas that I was able to discern as most important from this part 3. It's I think the shortest section, but maybe the most important. I'm going to punctuate that. I have like sort of notes here in yellow. I'm going to punctuate that with, I think, what are incisive questions to problematize the text or open the text up to contemporary dilemmas that socialists and Marxists and others have today. And then these are general questions, and I hope to get quite a lot of feedback. That being said, what I'd like you to do, and if possible, Daniel, to help me out with this, because I might get lost in my own notes. Under reactions, just go ahead and raise your hand if you want to just interrupt. I am very, very happy, especially with this part 3. This is a grab bag of concepts and not like a straightforward deductive argument. Just interrupt if you have something to say, especially if it's something critical, especially if it's like an objection to either something I'm saying or something that Engels is saying. I think that would be by far the most interesting thing to do. So if you're amenable, I'll just get to it. Yes? All right, good. First things first, the name. So, Anti-Duhring is rarely read, even amongst students taking a class in Marxist philosophy. Far more read is the pamphlet, which was spun out of particularly this section 3 of Anti-Duhring, Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. And it is such a bad title. It's a bad title specifically because it is, well, A, it's a mistranslation of the original. And it's also a bad title because it's misleading. Okay, socialism, utopian, and scientific sounds like there's bad socialism, which is the utopian socialism of someone like Saint-Simon, Fourier, or Owen. Okay, and then there's the good socialism of Marx and Engels themselves, and it's like this Manichaean battle of good versus evil socialisms. And when you actually read that pamphlet, but it's crystal clear when you read part 3 of Anti-Duhring, that's not what's going on. And I'll go over this at length when we get into it, but briefly, what's going on is that he's really criticizing directly the sort of mealy-mouthed reformism and actually the socially reactionary and chauvinist reformism of Eugen Dühring, okay, as well as the sort of formalistic, non-material, non-dialectical universalism of 18th century philosophy. He is then praising the utopian socialists of the early 19th century, 1800 roughly to 1808, for pointing out some of the hypocrisy of that formalistic, undialectical earlier materialist philosophy, but saying, well, it didn't go quite far enough, and by the way, it's not their fault. They couldn't have gone all the way there because the material conditions were not ripe enough for them to understand fully their, anyway, basically spot-on critique. And so we need to develop utopian socialism further to a properly Marxist socialism. And so a better translation, which you get sometimes in the minority of cases, is something less like socialism, utopian and scientific, again, a battle, Punch and Judy show, and something far more like socialism, from utopian to scientific. Okay, this is a minority of the cases translated like this, but I think it's a far better title, far closer to the original, because it shows that, well, true to form, to Engels, is sort of dialectical historical transformation from the sort of early but good utopian socialism to the mature, properly materialist and dialectical version that he's putting forth, as against Dühring and sort of formalists. Okay. I'm going to try and resist reading things to you. If you would like to follow along, I'm starting with A. The way I'll refer to things is by the presentation. So here, A, simply followed by the number of the slide. So like A1. So I'm talking about A1 now, and I'll just clue you in occasionally in case you want to, look into that, but I'll try not to read to you because that's boring. So here's where he starts, and this is a little bit of the holdover from part one. He says, indeed, is about these 18th century French philosophers, the materialists who led up to the French Revolution. He said that the problem with them is that they praise something called eternal reason. Oh, Daniel, you have a hand up?
Yeah, I guess the utopian to socialism piece. One way to think about that, and correct me if I'm wrong, would be to say that socialism writ large in Europe had begun as a utopian project. It didn't really begin. It morphed into a scientific worldview, or saw itself as a raison d'être of its own justification by reference to science. It's not therefore a value. It's not a claim, which I think is the intuitive claim that people make, which is that Marx and Engels have the cornerstone or the kind of proper scientific. It's not really saying that. He's really saying, right, because is that correct? It's sort of a reference to the historical evolution of socialism in its scientific phase. Is that fair to say?
Yes,
okay.
Yeah, exactly right. And I'm just seeing now Doug Green's comment, which I think gels with that idea, right? He says that in the first American edition, Daniel de Leon translated the title as Development of Socialism from Utopia to Scientific.
Okay,
absolutely. It's sort of this developmental idea of socialism, as opposed to rejection. Yeah,
okay.
No, thank you. That's very good. But as against, and here I'm at A1, okay, 18th century French philosophers, the philosophes leading up to the French Revolution, had themselves this Manichaean idea, this good versus evil idea, that the abuses of society are bad, especially the political abuses of the nobility, the feudalism, the aristocratic edifice of the ancien regime in France. Okay, those kinds of hierarchies and despotisms and tyrannies are bad. Eternal reason is good. Eternal reason is what judges the bad. And Engels at the opening of part 3 makes fun of this a fair bit and says that the so-called eternal reason, which the 18th century philosophers used to criticize the irrationalism of the ancien regime, wasn't really eternal reason, but it was really the ideal version of the bourgeois citizen, okay, the middle-class intellectual lawyer, especially, okay, but also in many ways the middle-class merchant, okay. And I think that's fine, and we can point out that historically that may have well been the case, that the philosophers had a blind spot, that they called what was particular and bourgeois eternal and universal. But it does beg the question that if eternal reason is put into scare quotes by Engels, is there such thing as real reason? It's not in scare quotes, right? And this is, we don't have to spend a lot of time on this because this was the main question from part 1, but he's bringing it in again in part 3, okay? Which is to say, if the 18th century conception of reason was in some ways one-sided or counterfeit, that it concealed a bourgeois particularism, it wasn't real universal reason, it was particular. Is there a real, true, genuine, transhistorical reason, or ain't there? I didn't know if anyone had any thoughts on that. So is there, and I guess we could ask it exegetically. If you'd like to answer exegetically, what do you think Engels would say? Fine. Or just really, just philosophically. Is there an actual standard of reason which one can use to judge other claims to reason as merely partial, merely bourgeois in this case. I could put it up to a vote. I'm tempted to do that. All right, let's do that. Okay, here's the question. Here's the question. Is there something like reason with a capital R, which goes beyond any particular time or place? Is there something called reason with a capital R, which is trans-historical? Yes or no? All right, and I'm going to try and threaten you, even though I have no power to. Okay, so look under the reactions tab, and if you think that indeed there is such thing as reason, which is trans-historical, reason which goes beyond any particular time and place, okay, raise your hand now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, cool. Can you put these hands down? Is that possible? You can. All right, lower them, lower them, lower them, lower them. All right. If you think that's BS, if you think that there is in fact not, he's right to point out 18th century reason is just bourgeois, but there isn't anything necessarily universal to contrast it with. There is no such thing as a trans-historical reason with capital R. Raise your hand now. 1, Carl, good. That's it.
You know I had to. You know I had to.
And no, I appreciate it. And, by the way, remind me if I forget, you posted something on Twitter recently about Daniel Graeber and bureaucratization.
Yeah, that's right.
Not just this second, but we're getting there. This is like prescient that you posted that one, and then I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name. Suzanne was clapping, so maybe like emphatic too. All right, good. So here's the question. If there's not, I guess I'll address Carl if you don't mind me calling you out. If there's not a trans-historical reason, how does Engels point out counterfeit reason? Right, like as like merely bourgeois. Right, what's the measuring stick by which he points out merely, in scare quotes, eternal, haha, but not really eternal, reason, like he does at the beginning of part 3. That's my question I was struggling with.
Well, I mean, I don't want to make this more about me. I mean, this is your show, Landon. But I mean, no. I mean, all I feel comfortable saying is, I feel very keenly the force of the question that you're posing.
Yeah.
I take it very seriously, and I wish I had an adequate answer, and I'm sort of painfully aware of the fact that I don't. But I also feel like this is part of the reason why I don't feel like I have an adequate answer is in part because of, very strong pragmatist and naturalistic commitments that I have. But I also take very seriously that there's going to be a real, I take very seriously the intellectual obligation that I've incurred.
Yeah.
As trying to sort of hold on to my pragmatist and nationalist commitments on the one hand, but also being very aware of the challenge that you pose as someone who's saying, well, look, if you don't have that kind of transcendent standard, then what's going to happen to any kind of radical politics that's worth defending?
I don't want to paint you with the scarlet letter of William James, because I know you're more sophisticated than that. But this sort of first order, second order dynamic reminds me of his essay on free will. And like the opening salvo in this essay is like, yeah, free will, definitely. I believe in free will. Can I prove to you that free will is the case? No, because in a second order way, that would go against my pragmatic belief in free will. Because if I could prove it was the case and compel you to believe it, then it wouldn't be free will. It has to be something like a choice. So likewise here, and I know it's not the same question, but I think there's a kind of, again, second order, first order analogy. It's like, if you could prove to me there's no such thing as eternal once and for all reason, well, you're already undercutting, I don't mean to pick on you specifically, but your position. You're already undercutting your own position if you can once and for all prove it, right? And so maybe, again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think it's an interesting position. Maybe you're being a little bit too humble, right? Maybe, and I disagree with you still, but maybe you're being a little bit too humble. And it's not just, oh, shucks, I haven't figured out the answers yet, but it's like, no, you can't figure out the ultimate answers, because if you did, what in the hell kind of pragmatist would you be if you figured out the ultimate answers, right? Or am I way off base here?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think if you want, I would not be, if you wanted to sort of paint me with the scarlet letter of any pragmatist, it would certainly be Dewey and not James.
Right.
And I think that there's like going to be this very, there's a question I need to work through for my own personal satisfaction, as well as, my having a position that's worth defending and worth sharing with others, as to what extent I think it's, really coherent to think of kind of a Deweyan view that's not about big R reason, but more about intelligence and the use of intelligence to resolve problems in which is certainly, very much the fighting faith of a kind of piecemeal reformism.
Yeah.
But to what extent it might be that could be taken in a more radical direction and synthesized with themes from Marx and Engels. And in some respects, I might even be willing to call myself someone who's trying to pick up where the early Sidney Hook left off.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. No. I get it, and I understand the Deweyism. And what's interesting is I'm a big fan of Engels. I think Engels does have quite a substantive, everything we talked about last time about his idea of especially freedom as insight into necessity, his idea that matter is eternal and matter is inherently tied to motion, which is also eternal and indestructible. He appears to be more of a metaphysician than he admits. He appears to be more of a rationalist with a capital R than he admits. But at the same time, he does have these sorts of lowercase democratic collaborative ideas about knowledge production, right? That it's the human mind has this eternal capacity to know, but each individual, well, they're a schmuck, and what you need is an infinite looking over everyone else's shoulder and moderate sort of correction scheme throughout history forever. Except, of course, as we're going to look at in 3 pages, humanity will one day die anyway. Right? So that as a rationalist, I feel like taking it on the chin a little bit, right? But good. All right, let's continue. Although I'm having trouble also trying to read the comments. I just saw one from Connor McGuire. Wouldn't Marx and Engels say something like, it is only because capitalism has become so highly developed that we, from the positions of the proletariat, can now see eternal truth? Well, indeed, that's a question, right? So certainly part of it would be, part of that statement that Engels would agree with is that we can only see the next step because the current epoch, capitalism, has matured to such a degree that it's already at a crisis period, and we can already see the manner in which it's breaking down. The question, of course, is this word eternal, right? Which is like, does the manner in which capitalism is breaking down indicate the eternal truth, or simply sort of the next thing in transient history that it's going to become? This is an open question, but I want to get to the family and socialism and how you pay people. So, all right, we'll put a pin in that and continue to bring it up in the future. So, A3 is that the contradictions of the so-called rationalist bourgeois revolutions, especially the French Revolution, led not to their success, but to their end in disaster, right? So we have the momentary ascent of the working class, we have the reign of terror, but this ended in a sort of bloody formalism. This is displaced by the directorate, and this is replaced by the consulate, and ultimately Napoleon Bonaparte and Bonapartism. And he said, society fares no better. I'm at A3 here, because the general prosperity and eternal peace that the bourgeois revolutionists, especially in France, promise, ended only with further antagonism between the rich and the poor, an increase in crime, feudal, and he said, right, feudal vices became private. They didn't disappear. So he says, there's fantastic images in Engels' writing. He's actually a very good writer. And he says that it used to be that the lord of the manor would stagger around, in this rapacious way, taking advantage of people, brutally lording over them, in this sort of direct fashion. There was the so-called right of prima nocta, not a historian, but I believe there's debate amongst historians whether this was real or not, but all that matters is that Engels thought it was real, the supposed right of the lord of the manor to have relations with a woman on the first night of their marriage. Watch that movie, Braveheart, okay, right? And he said, well, this stuff didn't go away, but it became like polite and bourgeois and privatized, right? And so you have marriage, bourgeois marriage, as, quote, the official cloak of prostitution, right? And it's very clear what he means by this. He doesn't mean that if you're married, it's not clear that you're employing prostitutes, right? He's saying that marriage itself is the official legal sanctification of prostitution, right? That people marry, right, and form family units as a way of retaining and passing on wealth. And it's one of the things that he critiques Eugen-Duhring on later in the section. And anyway, that this is supplemented with prostitution proper, right? A4 says that instead of general prosperity, the middle class becomes precarious, small artisans become proletarianized, increasing concentrations of homelessness, especially in industrial Britain. And very interestingly, Engels talks about the loosening of the traditional moral bonds, especially patriarchal subordination, right? He actually lists this alongside the demoralization of the working class and the overwork of women and children in the factory system. And so, of course, Engels is one of the most outspoken early socialist writers about feminism, the emancipation of women, and also, issues of children in the workplace. Okay, but here, he's not exactly praising patriarchal subordination, but he's sort of empirically listing it as one of the factors that kept pre-modern society sort of within the human frame. Okay, that people were not in pre-modern society mere appendages of the machine at the workplace. They were in this sort of semi-brutal primitive condition at home, but at least everyone sort of had some kind of permanency and stability in their lives, even if it was sort of brutal and hierarchical and nasty. And in any case, that there was no hope. There was no hope for the bourgeois revolutions to offer general prosperity and peace, because if, as he calls it, the propertyless masses gain control, this could only be a temporary situation. As he says, the proletariat still needed help without or from above. In other words, the leaders of the revolution, especially in France, were generally not of the sans-culotte. They generally were, lawyers, intellectuals, who were the people supplementing the emancipation of the working class. There wasn't a permanent ability for working class emancipation. All right, skipping ahead a little bit. Okay, so I'm already on B, utopian socialists. So again, Engels praises the utopian socialists of the early 1800s, again, especially Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen. Okay, not as identified with these early 18th century, eternal reason-minded French philosophers, but as the very first people who criticized their efforts. Okay, they said, it was in fact the case that the ideologues of the French Revolution were more advanced and had accurate criticisms of the completely irrationalist philosophies of the ancien regime. Okay, but they were still too one-sided, still too dialectical, and the utopian socialists pointed this out. But even they were limited by the lack of right conditions at their time. And so he says, this is a B2, presentation B, slide 2, that even the early socialists themselves were limited in their own ways. The example he gives is that the jargon he uses is that the crude capitalist and class conditions could lead to nothing but crude theories. And so what you get with these early utopian socialists, who he's impressed by, nevertheless, is a sort of inherent limitation where their advice comes out in basically two forms: A, propaganda, and B, model experiments, right? And so, of the three, it's very clear from part 3 of Anti-Duhring that Engels absolutely has fallen in love with Robert Owen. Right? He loves Robert Owen, but what is Robert Owen most famous for? He's most famous for his model experiment of New Lanark, which his text is named after. And what is this? Well, it's essentially a factory town, which is supposed to be a model for a humane existence for workers. Okay, but again and again through part 3, Engels says that this kind of model experiment, this sort of toy kit socialism, is necessarily doomed to failure as utopian. Right, that there needs to be not only a national but a global auto-emancipation of the working class, a global proletarian revolution. This sort of Epcot version, model city version of socialism simply can't work. Okay, but even so, he says that they anticipated a lot of things, even though they couldn't figure out the material solutions to capitalism and the construction of socialism. They anticipated a lot of what would come about in Marx and Engels. What are some examples of this? Well, first, Saint-Simon was perhaps the first of the utopian socialists, first theorist to surmise that one day politics would be completely absorbed by economics, right? So that, to use Marx's jargon, we would move from the administration of people over people to the administration of people over things. And because of this, Saint-Simon is thereby credited by Engels for theorizing about the abolition of the state. If the abolition of the state, in other words, is defined as a special apparatus of one class oppressing another, one group of people oppressing another, and Saint-Simon says, no, economics will have primacy, that will move to an administration of people over things, then we have in Saint-Simon the idea, fully developed in Marx, of the abolition of the state. Fourier was the one Engels credits as listing women's emancipation as the general measure for social emancipation. Okay, and so pegging these things to one another. He also credits Fourier with the dialectical insight, and here we have something potentially problematic and another question. With the dialectical insight that the unlimited perfectibility of the human race is impossible. Here we have another one of these, inspiring, problematic punctuations in part 3. So we have this association with Fourier and Immanuel Kant, really. Immanuel Kant famously speaks of the crooked timber of humanity, okay, that the best we can hope for is a kind of invisible hand model of progress, that the crooked timber of humanity never made anything straight, that at most our vices can work on one another in a sort of Darwinian manner, such that something good can be produced in this sort of outside external providential way, but that directly trying to perfect humanity won't work. He credits Fourier, again associating with Kant and then Engels, for a dialectical understanding of society, saying that societies ascend, they mature, and then they decline, okay, which he prefers to the 18th century French philosophe model of, well, we just have this eternal reason where we criticize everything. Instead, it's sort of historical and dialectical, okay? But then finally, and this is the part that I nearly went blind reading, he credits Fourier by talking about the ultimate and necessary destruction of the human race. He does this a lot, surprisingly, in Anti-Duhring. You get it in part 1, you get it in part 2, and now again in the discussion of Fourier, you get it in part 3. Remember, in part 1, he credits Kant with talking about the nebular theory of the universe instead of the sort of Platonic idea that the universe is, or the ancient Greek idea, the universe is just made of these perfect, spheres of motion that never change. Kant is the one who discerns, right, that actually the revolutions and rotations of planetary bodies, celestial bodies, is irregular and decays in a sense, and that the universe as a whole will eventually end up in a state of destruction. Well, in part 3, he's talking about Fourier and the destruction of the human race. There's something inherent to the human race that leads to its own destruction. And I wonder if that's like so I don't want to ask the group, because this is going to be on the internet, like, will the human race be destroyed? That's a bad look. But I want to ask philosophically, like, is this a rationalist idea with a lowercase r? Like, is this a reasonable idea? Is this something that like a sober philosophical position should include? That there's something necessary about the destruction of humanity? And does that fit with the rest of what Engels is about in terms of this sort of, I was talking about earlier with Carl Sachs, this sort of infinite but piecemeal progress of humanity forever? Doesn't that sort of grate against this idea of the necessary destruction of the human race? Yeah.
I'd say that if I don't think by destruction he's necessarily saying something like nuclear war or descent into barbarism. This could just be as simple as evolution, like that humanity, like other creatures, the rest of nature, can evolve into something else. And wouldn't that just be the destruction of humanity? It wouldn't mean that there wouldn't be conscious life and everything. It would just be a new species.
It may well be. There are two sort of like in the history of philosophy, two sort of competing ideas that I think are running in the background of Engels here. The first one is Spinoza's idea of the conatus, okay, C-O-N-A-T-U-S, that inherently every mode of God, every particular thing, it's something like existential inertia, just sort of inherently strives to go on being what it is, okay? And it's not spooky or providential. It's just that it's like structural, right? Like the rock keeps on being a rock unless it's acted on by an outside force, let's say the weathering effects of the stream of water going over it. But things don't spontaneously just disappear. And famously or infamously for a Spinozist, opposed to this is the Hegelian idea, which you get in the Encyclopedia and in less developed form, I believe, in the Phenomenology, of the so-called seed of death or the germ of death, which Hegel insists is not external teleology, not providential, right, in the bad sort of theological sense. It's not that everyone is foredoomed by an external creator to die, but that there is something inherent to the being of all finite entities, all finite creatures, that it ends in their own destruction. Now, Doug might be right that maybe that own destruction might be a transformation to something bigger and better, a new kind of consciousness, maybe, but I'm not sure I see that in this book, right? In fact, when he talks about the universe, he talks about it in a perfectly cyclical way, right? That you have, this is why it's called the nebular theory, right? That you have sort of dispersed matter in space, and then there's a sort of condensation, and there's an organization of the cosmos, and then eventually there's some kind of explosion again. It's a crude anticipation of the Big Bang, Big Crunch sort of model of the universe. I don't know. Let's see if there are some comments here. So I don't want to mispronounce anyone's name. Is it Cyril or Kirill or?
Kirill, yeah. Kirill.
You say that yes, universal in this sense is fine, and it's what Peirce, the pragmatist, called the end of inquiry, without the class analysis. And then Ray Brassier, okay, I just wrote a book on him. Nil Unbound is about this cosmology of the spirit. I'm really puzzled why anyone would oppose Engels here. Okay, good. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few ways to expand. The first is just like, obviously humanity will end just because of the second law of thermodynamics. So what I find interesting about Brassier's approach here is the extent to which this gives us a sort of nihilism, a sort of sense in which there isn't a God waiting for us, that makes our life more purposeful and more free than if life were infinite. What is interesting about Ilyenkov's version here, it's really two different essays, but in Cosmology of the Spirit, it's interesting that it's at the points that we reach the ends of inquiry and universal reason, where it's sort of a point where anyone has access to any knowledge, that we need communism for the end of inquiry, and yet we're saying that everyone knows everything. It also presupposes the end of us as humans, because it would, it kind of suggest a kind of overcoming of alienation, which is really an overcoming of us as embodied humans.
So if you don't mind a little bit, just to sort of basic out the discussion a little bit, why is it that the second law of thermodynamics spells the end of humanity precisely? Or not precisely, generally?
Because the sun will explode.
Yes.
What do you mean?
Well, right. So are you saying that the second law of thermodynamics sort of will necessarily end in not only the sun exploding, but something like the heat death of everything that is and always has been? Is that the idea?
Yeah, and things will be so spread out in terms of where energy is that we won't be able to reverse that thermodynamic process, and any form of life relies on the reversal of thermodynamic processes. And I think that the second law isn't something we can outrun that way.
So, and do you think then, just to go like a level deeper, that the second law then makes certain claims about the origins of the universe at the other end?
Yeah, it does. And I think that, again, relates to this idea about actually what universal reason is. I think an overlooked critic of Marx, a reader of Marx, is Alistair McIntyre, who's quite interesting. He firstly makes the quite mundane point that there's a type of universality to reason, in that there are things that we could show to Aristotle that would make him interesting. There are things we could show to the ancient Egyptians that would make him interesting, and we could quite quickly pick up a kind of a language to exchange reasons. But where he goes further than some of the pragmatists Carl and I are interested in is in saying, well, there's a kind of reasonableness to animals as well. There's actually things that are reasonable for a dolphin to do. And this reason, this purposiveness is tied into thermodynamics, is tied into how animals have this sort of ability to collect energy in ways where they are agents in their own collection of that agency. So ultimately, yeah, I think we can take it all the way back to the second law on the one hand, and how matter clustered at the very beginning. First place, not that I know where life originated, but presumably it still had something to do with structures that oppose thermodynamic systems.
Okay, and but do you think that this applies to? I don't mean to put you on the spot here. I'll open up to anybody, but happy to have you respond. Do you think that this applies specifically to organisms, individual organisms or creatures, right? So it's one thing to say, well, law of thermodynamics, the sun is going to expand. Perhaps we can outrun the sun. We can't outrun the universe. Fine. He seems to be making a rather more specific point here. This germ of death idea that, like, no, like there's something, so we have like you and Doug is like the polar opposite interpreters of this. Right? Doug is like, yeah, indeed, humanity might die in the sense of becoming better. Right? I know that's even more exuberant than how Doug put it. I'm just making a cartoon for pedagogical purposes. And you're having this sort of nihilistic Brassierian idea that no, there's meaning in the death, there's meaning in the end. Are you saying that this death, forget about the sun, applies to humanity itself, or there's like something like a metaphysical death drive as well?
I'm not that keen on Dev drive. Yeah, so in one way, I think it's something that we need to appreciate. So it affects humanity in the sense of, like, I don't know, mundane things like climate change, etc. And I think if we're thinking dialectically, to say that humanity will always be here is essentialist. Is to say that it's for some reason a fixed category, not dependent on its material conditions.
Right. So accelerationism, right, has a sort of anti-correlationism. Yeah, and that if you say that humanity is essential to the universe, this is sort of a bad phenomenology, that we need the specifically human frame in order to sustain the narrative that is the universe. Whereas we need to face up to the fact that we're not central to the universe. Something like that, or okay.
Yeah, sure.
I don't want to put words in your mouth. Is that?
I don't think accelerationism is particularly relevant. I think it's just the point Ray Brassi is making is kind of straightforward enlightenment followed through to Marx. It's just that what rationality is doing can be framed in terms of opposing the second law of thermodynamics, but nonetheless, it eventually catches up with us. I was just making a more mundane point.
Yeah, no, I get it.
Treat climate change more seriously and stuff.
Okay, all right. There's a lot I'd like to go off on about that, but I can't. All right, good. And just right now. Good. Let's get into a little bit of the let's see, what time is it? 4:50. Let's get into the bit of the historical materialism and political economy. So here, all right, so I'm on presentation C then, C1, historical materialism. So what's the next sort of move that Engels does after he does a brief survey of the historical materialists? He says, as a sort of rehash from part 2, in terms of his, and the Marxist idea of base and superstructure, that production first, but production and exchange together, right, determine the social structure, determine how wealth is distributed and how classes are arranged in a particular society. And that therefore revolutions, and this has a bearing on the discussion that we had, although an indirect one, revolutions and social change are therefore to be found not in philosophy, namely in ideals of eternal justice like you get with 18th century philosophers up to the French Revolution, but rather in the particular economics of each epoch. So my question, again, when I was reading this, is like, isn't this, just like in A1, a sort of a second order problem, right? If it's the case that the particular problems and therefore the particular remedies of, let's say, slavery or feudalism or capitalism are to be found in the economic organizations of those situations, those modes of productions, and not in some kind of eternal reason or eternal philosophy. That may well be true in the local sense, but the second order question is like, if not philosophy, then what tells you how to go about analyzing those various modes of productions, those various epochs, right? So unless you have a notion of reason, unless you have a notion of, right, what humanity is, unless you have a notion of ubiquitous rules of thought and nature, natural laws, unless you have ideas, and this is something I've discussed with Carl Sachs before, for example, so feel free to weigh in, unless you have something like a basic background knowledge about the architecture of the universe, the architecture of reality, and that's nothing other than philosophy, right? How is it that you go about looking at the particular economics of this time period or that time period in order to figure out, from whence comes the revolution, right? So again, I think that Engels is being a bit dismissive of philosophy here. He's always talking in two ways, right? He's dismissive of philosophy. He says we can naturalize philosophy and dissolve it into the natural sciences and political economy. And the very next sentence will often be something like, and so yes, there's nothing left of the form of philosophy, but of course we've kept the substance of it. And what remains of philosophy outside the sciences are dialectics and logic. So he always, takes away with one hand and gives with the other one, right? But anyway, let's move on from this discussion and get into the interesting social and political stuff. Okay, contradictions of capitalism, we know. Let's go to E. So in E, technology, expansion, and crisis, we get into really the meat of what is happening in Anti-Duhring part 3. Right? Why is capitalism breaking down specifically, and what is the type of socialism that's going to then replace it? So what does he say? He says that capitalism really starts to get going in the 15th century with new geographical discoveries and therefore new trade routes for merchants and therefore generalized commodity production and trade, not just within each country, but internationally as well. This then leads to commercial wars, and especially, I believe he's referring to the English and Dutch commercial wars of the 17th and 18th centuries. Okay, need for greater efficiency in production, need for expansion of machinery. Okay, and then we have this idea that human beings themselves become simply fractions of the machine, right? They become appendages of modern industry and modern global trade and competition. And then he highlights a particular kind of contradiction, okay? And this is E3. He says that there's, because of the need to make profits, there's a need to ever increase the extension of markets, but that the extension of markets can never keep pace with the extension of production, right? So we have two particular elements here. And here I'm at, again, E3, that the extension of markets can never keep pace with the extension of production. In other words, no matter how many trade routes we open up, no matter how many commercial wars we engage in, again, referencing the 17th and 18th century English and Dutch commercial wars here, okay? No matter how feverish the pitch of imperialism and colonization might be, the extraction of raw materials and the forcible opening up of new markets throughout the entire world, okay? This extension of markets will never keep pace with the extension of production. Capitalism becomes a victim of its own impulse to increase its efficiency more and more and more. Production becomes more and more efficient such that markets will never keep up. This is the proximate cause of capitalist crisis. And it is related to another kind of crisis that we get in capitalism, which is this, that capitalism begins by socializing production while keeping the appropriation of what is produced under capitalism private. So we have capitalist or private appropriation alongside socialized production. What does capitalism do that makes it capitalism? It makes industry more efficient by gathering the means of production from the original artisans with their individual tools that they owned, right? This is the sort of classic Marxism 101, right? The hammer of the blacksmith becomes the giant building-sized steam hammer, okay? And the steam hammer and the assembly line that the steam hammer belongs on can only be worked by an assembly line of workers. But because these means of production are so humongous and gigantic, the only, they cannot be owned by private small-scale producers. They can only be owned by large capitalist enterprises, eventually, namely, corporations. And this brings us to his critique of the sort of reformism of Dühring. So that's sort of basic Marxism 101. How does this articulate with the critique of Dühring? So here I'm on presentation E, slide 5. So he says, and this is very important for today's politics, he says that the issue with Dühring and other reformists, and reformists today, is that when there's an economic crisis, this is explained in terms of underconsumption. Right? This is, by the way, not just Dühring, but all social democrats, all sort of, New Deal liberals, right? That you explain the crisis in terms of underproduction. People are poor, they don't have enough healthcare, medical care, housing, and not only do they not have enough healthcare, medical care, and housing, but markets are failing because people don't have enough money to buy stuff. Okay, so crises of underconsumption. Interestingly, Engels does not say that underconsumption is false. This is I've read a lot of the secondary literature on Anti-Duhring, and one of the things that people just sort of gloss over is they're like, well, a good Marxist that he is, he talks about crises of overproduction. He doesn't care about underconsumption. That's not true. In Anti-Duhring Part 3, he says, actually, it is true that there's underconsumption. But he says, since there has been exploitation before capitalism, since there has been class society, okay, underconsumption has always been the case. He calls underconsumption the constant. Okay, this is the mathematical analogy he gives. Underconsumption is the constant, the transepochal, transhistorical constant, okay? Whereas overproduction is the variable. So it's like, yeah, of course there's underconsumption. There's poor people, there are people who are exploited and their surplus labor is taken over by another person and another person's work is shouldered by them. That's true. But underconsumption, because it's a constant of everything since primitive communism and even maybe in primitive communism, common tilling of the soil, okay? It doesn't help to explain the market-oriented crises that you get every 50 and then 40 and then 10 and then 5 years, right? The market-oriented crises, the booms and busts, cannot be accounted for by underconsumption precisely because underconsumption is true and ubiquitous and transhistorical. That's his sophisticated point, okay? And so we need to look at overproduction itself, okay? The question, I think, for today's politics, okay, is therefore not, I mean, we can argue whether overproduction is a thing. Well, I think my gut feeling is that most of us in this room probably believe that it is, okay? But the question for today's politics is whether overproduction can simply be managed, right? So even if you accept the Engelsian arguments that not only is there underconsumption, but the proximate cause of crises is overproduction, right? Because we have this need to always increase efficiency and therefore there's a decline in the rate of profits because things become so efficient that they become unprofitable and that you can't find new enough markets fast enough to absorb that shock, okay? Can it be managed by reformist, liberal, Keynesian means of like stimulating demand, of buying up troubled assets, by subsidizing workers' housing, by putting more and more stimulus into the economy, right? Like, is there an end to that, or can it just go on forever? Because if it could just go on forever, right, that means something for the kinds of political agendas, political formations that we support. And if it means you can't do that forever, then that means something quite different, doesn't it? This is like, it's sort of mathematical, but it's like the question, right, of reformism or non-reformism within the socialist debate. So I was wondering if someone had something to say about that, right? Like, so A, is Engels right that the problem is overproduction? And B, if he's right, can you just manage overproduction indefinitely by bailing people out and giving them stimulus? What do you think? Anyone want to jump in? We're gonna do a vote to put people on the spot.
It's been a big topic of debate among Marxist economists in the 20th and 21st centuries. Like the young Paul Swayze actually accepted a good deal of Keynesian economic analysis. At the same time, he thought that the ability of the capitalist state to use Keynesian economics to rationally manage overproduction was limited. It might be able to do it in the short run, but not in the long run. And later on, I think Swayze became more skeptical about Keynesian economic analysis anyway, but in his first book, he pretty much accepts Keynes' analysis of capitalism and says, but given the nature of the capitalist state, you cannot really apply the kinds of formulas that Keynes might have advocated over the long run.
Right.
That was the position of Kalecki as well.
Well, yeah, that's right. And you know, classically, people have gotten more creative, but there's like sort of two ways of dealing with overproduction, typically under capitalism. One is people end up poor, so you stimulate the economy, you give them cash payouts or, you know, payouts in kind. Or two, you destroy stuff, right? So you know, famously, when the price of milk dropped in the early 20th century, you dump the milk into the sewers, right? Or you have perhaps a war and you sink multiple billions of tons of, you know, product at the bottom of the ocean, right? Perhaps not on purpose, but anyway, it does the trick, right? And I guess the, you know, like, can you keep doing that or not? What's Jim? If you don't mind asking, what's your opinion? Do you agree with it, or you think that there is a limit, or what's your opinion?
Apparently, there is a limit because no capital state has actually succeeded in managing production overproduction and over the long run.
Right. It just keeps being a problem.
Doesn't go away. I mean, back in the 60s, a lot of the Keynesians thought they had the problem licked.
Yeah.
You know, they talked about the new economics, and they thought, well, and Paul Samuelson made a big deal about the Kennedy tax cuts, and they're saying this is this is how the future would be like what Kennedy was doing at the time. And by the 70s, it turned out that it wasn't so easy to do.
So do we accept the sort of monetarist or even the more fringe Austrian school position that?
Well, that's basically how it came back into fashion during the 70s and 80s because of the failures of Keynesianism. But we've had like 30 or 40 years of you know, monetarism and attempts to follow the Austrians, and we're not really any better off.
Right. It's just going to be this sort of continuing quagmire forever.
So I mean, so basically, this sort of a fluctuation. I mean, that in 2008, everybody started doing Keynesian type economic stimulus policies again. But as soon as things got a little bit better, they started going back to austerity again because.
Yeah. Because, well, and amongst other things, they were afraid of runaway inflation as well, right? All right. So what's interesting is then, right, because he didn't live through, you know, 2008 or COVID, right? Engels then says that, okay, so in trying to manage these crises, right? Well, a few things happen. The first thing that happens is that you have this amazing pedagogical picture show of why capitalism is shot through with contradiction. So what happens when profitability falls? And here I'm at, oh, and I see Matthew and Doug have hands up. So let me just throw a couple things out and I'll call on both of you. What happens when profitability falls and production is shut down, workers are locked out? Again, here I'm in E6. You have this fantastic thing that he says. He says, it's just a beautiful piece of writing. He says, the necessity of this transformation to capital, things become no longer profitable and can't be transformed into capital in order to be produced. The necessity of this transformation into capital of the means of production and subsistence stands like a ghost between these and workers, namely between machinery and resources and workers themselves. It alone, this need to change resources into capital, prevents the coming together of the material and the personal levers of production. It alone forbids the means of production to function, the workers to work and live. In other words, it's this imperative for profitability, okay, and only this artificial imperative for profitability that uniquely under capitalism, as opposed to earlier epochs, earlier means of production, right, shut down production and cause people to starve to death, right? It's no longer some kind of external threat. There's a disease, there's a famine, there's a flood, there's a fire that causes people to be poor and destitute and hungry and lack medical care and housing and be on the street, right? It's this artificial human sort of requirement for profit, okay, and the contradictions therein that stand like a ghost because it's immaterial, it's nothing but a social convention that stops people from using machines to make things that people want, right? that's the sort of maddening thing about capitalism. He's going to bring back at the end of part 3 when he talks about his critique of religion as people imagining these social forces as external and hostile, even though they're truly just of our own making. Okay, but before I get into that bit, the next part's really, really good. I think, I don't know who was first, Doug maybe, or?
Well, I just wanted to add, like, when you actually have like a crash, when it does get to the bust,
Yes.
is on the one hand, I think you have on the, the ruling class, they have more resources always at their disposal. So they have like a bit of room to maneuver.
Yes.
And you can look at this like in like the Great Depression, whether in the United States where, okay, they tried what Herbert Hoover was doing, just kind of not do anything. And then they like, okay, let's do the New Deal. So they actually had options available. And of course, there are, other countries, say Germany, just like, well, let's just imprison all the trade unionists, the communists, and get rid of democracy in general. So now, in a sense, you could say, well, Germany got Hitler got Germany out of the Depression, but that was by going to war.
Yeah.
That was the extreme solution, which actually ended up basically destroying, Germany before, as it had previously existed. But the thing I would say is like, sometimes the crisis can get so severe that you do end up in these cul-de-sacs that, the system could collapse. I don't think that should be discounted. But, and because of the way capitalism has innovation, we've developed such destructive weapons that, the way out could just be like a war that blows everybody up. That's not super impossible, especially right now. But the other point I would add, just to be a bit more hopeful, more optimistic, is the crisis, or what I would call breakdown, creates the conditions for revolution. If enough people, it reveals the fault lines of society, the contradictions, and you can have the possibility where, the proletariat becomes conscious and just brings the whole structure down because it has been so shaken by breakdown that can happen.
So the classic dichotomy in terms of political economy and politics, right, is that if capitalism could go on managing itself, whether more destructively through war or less destructively through stimulating the economy or destroying commodities in a sort of non-martial fashion, if it can manage itself, then this leads to a sort of liberal and at best welfarist politics, right? You just want to manage things, hopefully somewhat for the benefit of working people, maybe sometimes. Okay, but you don't need a revolutionary party. On the other hand, there are people who say that the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is something like an irresistible force, and that you'll either end up with world cataclysm or socialism, and so that we therefore must absolutely have global socialist revolution, right? And I'm wondering, like, are those two camps like necessarily opposed and well defined, those two constellations, or could it be that even if capitalism could manage things, maybe indefinitely, maybe for 100 or 200 years, there's still enough empirical evidence out there, right, to get people to embrace the revolutionary ethos?
I mean, I'd say that the camps, there are fairly clear polls on that. There is like the breakdown tendency school, Grossman, whomever. And then there are people, like the more reformists. I think between that, there are people who do try and muddy the waters. And no offense, Jim, that's a lot of the monthly review people who do that but ultimately, you do have to make choices on this. Either the system is going to break down or it's not. Either it's going to be able to go out or, to hang on, or it's not. And I think, if you accept, the Marx critique that capitalism has unresolvable contradictions, then I don't think you can be a Keynesian. I don't think you can, reconcile that with reformism. I think you have to be a proletarian revolutionary in that case. Again, I do think there are interesting experiments and ideas in the middle of that, but ultimately, I do think there are clearly defined poles on that.
So for sure, yeah, just to refine the question a bit, for sure, if you think that capitalism will necessarily break down under the weight of its own contradictions, it's hard not to be a socialist, a revolutionary socialist. I guess my question is the inverse, which is, even if you think capitalism could go on managing its own contradictions, does that allow you anyway to be a revolutionary socialist? That's because, and the reason I'm asking is specifically in light of this book, because Engels seems to stubbornly argue against the sort of moralizing position, right? He thinks that like morality can't outpace the sort of empirical insight into the structure of things. It's only because you see the system necessarily breaking down that socialism becomes A, possible, and B, something that will enter the general consciousness. So I guess that would be my refined version of the question.
I mean, I think if you're a socialist, then you can do things, fight for reforms and stuff when the system is not breaking down and whatnot.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I do actually think there is a choice that has to be made between either revolution or reform, which, and that of course is how you understand reality ultimately in those contradictions.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Matthew?
Hi, yeah. I was gonna say, just keeping with the book and not just straying into, sheer speculation. I think Engels takes a hold of a couple of different sets of variables. I had 3 sets of variables I was thinking of, and then I lost the third one because I did. So
That's all right.
He talks about the anarchy of the market and that opposed to the regimentation in the workplace. And he talks about how one necessitates the other, but they both kind of work to reinforce each other. Another variable is the need for profit making versus human need and how these are set opposed to each other. The idea that you can reform under capitalism implies that capitalists would move to set profit making aside. And as that is their engine for prosperity, I would say that's a categorical no. They, to the, yeah, I mean, there's that. So I had a third one, and I can't remember it right now because my brain works that way. But when Rosa Luxemburg quotes Engels on the question of socialism or barbarism, what I really think that I don't think it's a rhetorical flourish. I think it's them emphasizing these sets of variables and saying, look, it's either one way or the other. There's no middle ground. You can't have your cake and eat it too. There's no way. You either organize for profit making or for human need. Human need can be addressed through profit making, but it's never going to be enough. And it's always going to be that ghost between humans in need
Yes.
and what they need, because what they need may not be available in a profit making system that relies on the anarchy of the market. The anarchy of the market guarantees that there's going to be that commodity, which is labor power, that will be a source for profit making. As soon as it's not, as soon as that's thrown into chaos, that one variable, then then it's chaos for the capitalist class. It may be a boon for regular working people to suddenly have those needs met. Suddenly the bananas aren't set on fire. The milk isn't thrown down the drain. Suddenly it's
All people are starving, right?
Suddenly they're not starving, but guaranteed companies would go out of business as soon as that would happen. Gas or all the prices would go haywire, and the it's during this recovery, and this is the last thing I'll say. During this last recovery, all of the news items said that things are looking up during the pandemic recovery. Of course, they left out the silent part for the capitalists, while many people were losing their houses, they were evicted, this and that. If the reverse was true and all of the people were given housing, food was plentiful, blah, 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 the capitalists would be crying bloody murder and saying, you can't, this is not sustainable. You know, society will go haywire. Well, no, in general, it won't. Not for regular working people.
Yeah, so if everyone was housed and clothed and given medical care, but the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 300 points a day after day after day, no, you're right. MSNBC and CNN and Fox would not say things are looking up. They'd say, you know, the purge is around the corner, right? But what's really interesting, Matthew, about what you brought up is like, so how do we parse this statement, socialism, or this phrase, this slogan, socialism or barbarism? So a lot of the times, right, we parse this statement, and it goes into this idea of the necessity of a revolutionary party. We parse this idea as because of the decline in profitability and the increasingly bad crises, eventually there will either be socialism, the taking into the common hands of everyone the means of production, or there will be, and then you insert dystopian idea here, Nazism, fascism, global thermonuclear war, or something like that, right? But what you're describing is, you know, I'm not sure how I feel about it yet, but it's in any case something more graspable and something more subtle, which is like, no, the barbarism is here now, right? Like there's socialism or barbarism questions like all the time, every day, which is like, is it the barbarism of keeping the market up, but people are not able to afford a house and medical care, right? Or is it the socialism of distributing these goods, which are only, you know, separated us from, as he says, right, something ghostly, namely the profit motive, but then the profit motive will necessarily take a hit, right? So, I mean, I think that's like a sort of fantastic way of like injecting some nuance into this otherwise sort of Manichaean debate as well. I don't know what I think about it, but I think it's really,
Well,
really
I mean, you could look at barbarism as like a worsening crisis, or you could look at it as our present and the way things are going. I mean, maybe all they meant to a certain extent was, we will keep going along this road that we are going on. It's going to get worse. People are going to get poorer. Gas prices are going to get higher. And that's the barbarism that they were, of course, at the time that they were talking about. I mean, there was what, when she was talking about it, there was world war, there were depressions, things were getting much worse than in Engels' era. So you could see this sort of ramping up of how bad things could get. It wasn't this cosmic, you know, nuclear war on the horizon. They probably didn't even think in those terms yet.
right.
But they could see the difference between, you know, the 1880s and, you know, 1916, 1917, when people were dying in droves in the trenches.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let me throw some more grist in the mill, because this is good. I want to keep it going. And I'm going to necessarily skip over a lot here. But in terms of how Engels says capitalism manages these crises, he says one of the things that capitalism does is to nationalize industry and increasingly, you know, larger sections of industry, the commanding heights of industries, right? Talks especially about transportation, communication, and sometimes banking as well. And he says that this accomplishes a couple things, okay? He says that when a branch of industry is nationalized, it is, again, a sort of pedagogical picture show. It shows why the merchant and why the capitalist entrepreneur are not in fact needed, why actually everything can be done, you know, for human need by salaried employees, right? So you need the manual laborers and you need the engineers and you need, you know, service people, okay? But you don't actually need the investor to do anything. They no longer perform a social function. But interestingly, he says that the transition of sections of industry to state ownership does not do away with the capitalist economy. And this is, again, very important for contemporary debates amongst Marxists and socialists. He says, and here, if you want to look at the relevant quote, okay, I'm not going to read it, but if you want to check my notes, it's presentation E, slide 8, okay, if you wanted to look at it. It says that the transition to state ownership doesn't do away with the capitalist economy, okay? But it just makes the state the phrase he uses is the national capitalist, okay? That it still exploits workers as wage workers, and someone who's worked for the state, I can say that, like, at least phenomenologically, yeah, that's true. All right, same thing for people who work for nonprofits. So they act and behave like profit-seeking capitals, okay? But he says that the state is national capitalist. And I guess one of the questions I had here is, like, elsewhere in part 3 even, Engels says that in order for capitalism to be capitalism, there has to be not only generalized commodity production, but generalized commodity production amongst a number of separate capitals, separate private producers who produce for the reason of exchange. And I guess one question that we could ask as socialists is, like, why does quantity not equal quality here? So I understand why nationalizing just one industry will not threaten, but only perhaps buffer or augment from shocks the general capitalist scheme of society. But why wouldn't nationalizing more and more the commanding heights of the entire economy have the effect of countering the capitalist system? I mean, so maybe it wouldn't happen for that reason, but he's saying something here, at least as far as I can tell in the quote from E8, that the state taking over more and more sections of the economy simply makes it a national capitalist, does not challenge the capitalist economy. Why is that? Why is that? Matthew?
Well, simply, it's a simple matter of who's in charge.
Okay.
I mean, who's doing it? You know, you can't have one before the other. You can't slowly, well, the theory goes that you cannot go and slowly nationalize all industry under the state and then somehow have a socialist utopia. That's what we were sold by the Stalinists et al. But who was in the driver's seat when they were doing those things? Who was in the driver's seat when they made whatever the National Medical Service in Britain was called? And by the way, the Tories have been trying to break down ever since.
Yep.
Capitalists are still in the driver's seat, and they are looking to reverse those trends, you know, as they have, you know, over the last several decades. So as long as the proletariat is not in power, nationalization is not a socialist gesture. At best, it's a backstop for a crisis. I mean, we saw when we saw whoever it was bailed out the auto industry. You know, you could almost say they nationalized it, at least put the financial future of it under national auspices. You know, they pay off corn growers in, you know, the Midwest to dump their corn or to keep prices where they are. But it's not the proletariat in the driver's seat doing it for human need. It's the capitalists in the driver's seat doing it for profit making. So one is socialist under a proletarian dictatorship, the other is not under the capitalist dictatorship.
So here's the wildly optimistic story some people might tell about nationalization of industry. The wildly optimistic story would go something like this. Indeed, barring a massive proletarian social movement, industry is not nationalized specifically to meet human need. It's meant to bolster the system from contradictions within the system, the shocks of increasingly bad crises. And so you nationalize, you know, transportation or the banking or, you know, the postal or communications industry, one after the other, you know, merely to keep everything in place. But goes the wildly optimistic story. Eventually, you know, once you pop, you can't stop. and you have to keep doing it in order to stave off just like the worst sort of breakdown, and that eventually you will, not through workers' mass consciousness, but unconsciously, okay, just through the logic of the situation, sort of back yourself into a position where the commanding, not every part of the economy, but the commanding heights of the economy are now in fact nationalized, even though that wasn't your goal when you started the process. And anyway, isn't that good? Right? Isn't that it sort of has a nice, historical, materialist, non-idealist, form to it, this kind of story, right? I'm not saying I like the story, but I think we at least have to take it seriously, right? It's the logic of events that push it forward, as opposed to a sort of a moralistic crusade. And look, because we have to manage these contradictions of capitalism, we end up in a position of having to nationalize and rationalize more and more of the commanding heights of the economy. And then we can make use of this, new fact on the ground.
Sure, but what happens after those events? Yeah, ask Postmaster DeJoy, who's basically trying to re-privatize the post office back from where we placed it in its heightened place. It is possible to undo these things, and as we've seen, that's the answer to that optimistic view.
So good. So this is the point of my question. So is the answer to the optimistic view, there's two kinds of answers we can give if we want to be critical of it. One kind of answer is, indeed, we could do that, but we won't like the result, because the people in charge will be sort of nasty crypto capitalists or, bureaucratic collectivist creeps or something. So we can nationalize without a revolutionary movement the commanding heights of the economy, but we won't like the result. That's one answer. Okay, or the other answer is, no, you can't do it. That it won't in fact happen, that these kinds of movements to nationalize only exist so long as there's an imminent crisis. You point to the postal office and DeJoy, indeed, right? That once there's any let up in the crisis, people will quickly, sell off public assets to private stakeholders and privatize, and under the name austerity or school choice or whatever it is, give it all back. So which is the authentic response? Is it that it's totally not possible without the revolutionary movement, you'll never nationalize the commanding heights, or it's possible, but it's, to steal from Hayek, it's the road to serfdom, that you won't like what you get, but you can get it?
What I'd say to that is, it is possible.
Okay.
And it's not, unsurprisingly, Hayek is wrong. It's not the road to serfdom. It's just the road to more capitalism. So give you an example, like he wrote, I believe, The Road to Serfdom, like 1944-45. It's around when Britain had a major election where Churchill and Tories were voted out, and they brought in the Labour Party government under Clement Attlee. And they did nationalize large swaths of the economy. They had like a very progressive domestic agenda, the National Health Service and whatnot. The mines were brought into public ownership, but they maintained the British Empire in large swaths of the world. Like hundreds of millions of people were under their jack boot. The monarchy, that's still there. And you can look at other European countries also nationalized large swaths of the economy. France did that after World War II as well. And there was a threat there even more than Britain. There were armed partisans and, the Red Army not too far away. But the French Empire went on in Vietnam, in Algeria, and unfortunately, France is still capitalist. So the thing is, yeah, you can nationalize, but it is compatible with capitalist social relations, because they didn't abolish. In fact, a lot of capitalists, I think they might have got bailouts or compensation or whatnot. I mean, it's one thing if you nationalize something under like a workers' government where you just kick them out and like, bye, you're gone, and you set up a planned economy and whatnot. I mean, so yeah, you can do it, but Hayek is so extreme that he just sees any form of just even like raising the minimum wage under his view would be a step toward tyranny, but somehow Auguste Pinochet is not. But that's another story.
Sure. No, I take your point. I guess the question is like, the optimist response to that would be like, yeah, but the French and British maintained their repressive, chauvinist overseas empires because they didn't nationalize enough, right? Like, yeah, like the Tories were voted out and they nationalized a lot of industries, but if they really fully nationalized, then there wouldn't have been, the profit motive. To fully nationalize means that you're essentially producing things for need, even if it's not your original intent when you started the process, right?
Where do you think the slack came from? It's not that if they only nationalized enough, they would be able to get rid of the colonies. The colonies were part of the basis of, oh yes, it's a car, honey. Were part of the basis of the slack necessary to, take some of those industries off of the profit motive and make them more for need.
Yeah.
If they got rid of the colonies, guaranteed there would be a national, furor over, well, we got rid of the source of our wealth, so we can't afford to nationalize these industries for your benefit. They're related materially. They're not just sort of categories that, or they're not free floating. Without having done any of the reading on it.
No, it's fine. Yeah.
My guess is that the reason they were able to nationalize in part was because they had those sources of national wealth, and
Which they could use to nationalize industry.
Right.
Okay. So I guess the basic question, right, is this: can you nationalize the lion's share of a country's industry and still maintain capitalism? Yes or no? This is a fundamental question. Is it possible to nationalize the commanding heights of an economy and still have it be a capitalist economy?
Well,
Yes,
Great Britain did that.
What?
Great Britain did that during the
Yeah.
post-1945 period, and it was still a capitalist country, even though they had nationalized some of their biggest industries, like the nationalized coal, they nationalized transportation, they nationalized the steel industry.
So is there a point after which quantity becomes quality that you, or is there no limit to it, that you can go on nationalizing and nationalizing and nationalizing and still have capitalism?
It depends on who's in the driver's seat. That's the ultimate. That's the ultimate answer. It depends upon for whom you're doing the nationalizing. If you're nationalizing for human need, that's one thing. If you're nationalizing to continue to lessen the contradiction between the anarchy of the market and the regimentation of the workplace, and all of that, that's a completely different thing. You can't call that socialism. Lots of people have called that socialism. I'm pretty sure sections of the DSA call that socialism, but it's not. So,
okay. I mean, the only reason we'll move off this topic now, but the only reason I ask is because there seems to be two threads within part 3 of Anti-Duhring, right? One thread is we need to produce for human need. Society as a whole needs to take control of the means of production for human flourishing. There's a sort of moral argument here, okay, if not one totally divorced from material necessity. The other thread seems to be that the means of production and appropriation are what determine the superstructure character of society. Right? This is the other side of it, right? And that like how things are produced and why determines the character of society, including its philosophy and its ethics and morality. And he says, in addition, that capitalism requires a number of different separate private appropriators in order to produce for their own need and for exchange. And that aspect of part 3 of Anti-Duhring, at least, seems to suggest that no, indeed, that like you can't have a single capitalist right? Having a single capitalist, no matter what the ideas are in your head, no matter what's in your soul, no matter what kind of ethics you have, right? It doesn't matter. I'm not sure I agree or disagree with this, but I'm just sort of communicating, these are the two threads in part 3 of Anti-Duhring, that it doesn't matter about the superstructure in your head or your heart, that if you're not privately accumulating amongst a different of separate and external and private capitals, you won't have capitalism. There does seem to be this basic tension in the text, and so it indeed goes to the question of how much do we need to care about who's in the driver's seat, or simply how much do we need to care about destroying the patterns of capitalist production and exchange, right? Does it matter, what the ideology of the Revolutionary Party is, or does it matter if the Revolutionary Party smashes the current relations of production and exchange, right? And this is sort of a, the deep version of the live debate within socialist movements today. Okay, but I don't want to leave the other juicy stuff. So let me just jump on that a little bit. All right, so related to this presentation F, he talks about the state under socialism. So about the means of production, he says that when the state, the workers' state, finally takes into its hands, in the name of society as a whole, all of the means of production, this is both, in a very poetic way, Engels says, the first and last independent act of this workers' state, right? That once it takes into its hands the entire means of production, the state dies out, it withers away. It doesn't need to be abolished. So this is, contra the sort of anarchist idea. Okay, the state is not abolished outright, but it dies out because what is the state? The state is the special repressive apparatus of one class of people repressing another class of people, right? The ruling class against those who are not in the ruling class. And I was curious about what the group thought about this. It's related to our question about who's in charge, right? So indeed, Engels says the state is not abolished, but it merely dies out because society, gets used to producing things for need, okay? And it doesn't need these special separate acts of repression. But he says in part 1, right, that even at the earliest stages of the common tilling of soil under primitive communism, there was something like a nascent proto-state. And what did this nascent proto-state do? Even before, or at least coterminous with the very earliest glimmers of class divisions. Well, this early proto-state under primitive communism performed religious functions. Okay, I guess maybe that's out. But it also made sure that no one took special privileges, especially social privileges, privileges of esteem, which properly belonged to other people. It adjudicated conflicts between people and groups of people, and adjudicated conflicts between the group as a whole and external groups, so foreign relations, right? And in the kind of deeply modernist, deeply complex society that Engels imagines the future socialism will be, does he really think that we can dispense with the state eventually? And he claims that he thinks that, okay? But in such a complex state, won't we still need people to guard against the assumptions and the overstepping and the grasping of privilege and of esteem and of position of other people? And what exactly do we mean by this withering away of the state? It's not the withering away of governance. He says that very clearly. There'll still be governance. And what about things like, the classic theorists of political science? We'll talk about the justified monopoly over violent coercion, monopoly over violent power, right? Like, so wouldn't we want that to be, although rarely used because there's no sort of structural class antagonism, when that power is needed and when that power is called upon, wouldn't we want that power in the sort of accountable democratic hands of a public entity rather than a lynch mob, an informal posse, right? So I guess the question is like, right, do we actually think that this idea makes sense, this withering away of the state? And am I ill-defining it, or is Engels ill-defining it? what do we actually, what does one actually want in terms of the withering away of the state? Shiro.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I guess it's of course, yeah, a huge discussion.
Yeah.
I would again personally draw on Alistair McIntyre. I see it as essentially getting rid of people who are managers rather than participants in a practice. So, for example, it would be a system in which it's teachers who decide how schools run, and that doesn't mean there can't be roles of hierarchy. The system we have at the moment is our education secretary, and the past 6 education secretaries have never been teachers or school governors or associated with schools in any ways. They are managers, and the whole of the state is a class of managers, and managers being those who can't recognize what is good because they're not practicing the things over which they are ruling. So to me, to not have a state is to have this dynamic structure where those who are most knowledgeable, most skilled, kind of rise up in the way that they do locally within specific practices. But I take your point. I certainly wouldn't want a kind of to go to any form of anarchism or anything like that.
Okay, and if I'm sorry, I'm trying to clock what you said. So at least part of what you said is you want to get rid of people who merely manage but don't participate.
So the manager is quite hard to explain, but it's a very interesting reading of Marx that McIntyre gives in After Virtue. The thing about managers is they focus on becoming better and better at being managers, and they are taking things in their essential properties as they're categorizing things. So the things that are involved in the decision making end up being as power, and not power that comes through reason in the way that a doctor in a hospital might have the most power, but power that is entirely kind of abstracted. It has no relation either to concrete practice or to what is reasonable within that practice.
Okay, great. And I apologize if I mangle the name. Is it Tiana, perhaps?
Sorry, yeah, it is. Thank you. I just wanted to say, I mean, that, yeah, again, a huge question, but I guess from sort of my feminist perspective, the question of the state is obviously one of the most important and fundamental questions. Least of all, I think we could have at least intuited what the state might mean, not just during the wars and things, but during COVID as well. So, whether we wanted more state intervention or less state intervention, but in any case, it was obvious that there was something peculiar about the institution of the state. But I think, the whole thing withering away, I tend to read that not that state disappears and that we become some, anarcho community where, there is no rules, no norms, no regulations or whatever, but that simply state stops being the contractor on the market, as it were, one of the contractors, because that's the role of the state, essentially, to mediate between the private capital and the population or the people, not just in terms of the, the use of coercive elements and state, army, police apparatuses, or Charles Tilly's, state as a racket, basically. But on the other hand, with the, the whole idea of regulating actually the surplus labor power, labor force, and population. So I think that, when he talks about the possibility of withering away of the state, it is precisely that state is not this mediating element or mediating force between the worker, which supposedly won't be the worker working for some private capitalist, and hence the role of the state would be significantly altered once the this private multinational capital or whatever you want to call it. And then there's another thing which I always find interesting. Everyone, all all decent liberals and capitalists will talk about, the free market and how free market is great, and it's competitive and competitiveness, and whoever is better survives, those who are weaker, they unfortunately don't. It's just that they always forget to tell us that capitalism ends up in monopolies and oligopolies, which is contradictio in adjecto, because that's exactly the opposite of the plurality that the capitalist system professes, basically. So that's sort of all I wanted to say for now, I guess, about the subject of the withering away of the state.
This is great. So avoiding the role, anyway, the first thing is avoiding the role of the sort of mediator between capital and labor, between capitals and capitals, which is very I get absolutely what you're saying. And of course it would follow, if you get rid of capital, then you get rid of the role of a mediator of capital. Of course, it's very, living in the sort of pessimistic times that we do, it's very, oh, I wish I had a red wine. It's very emotionally counterintuitive, right? So I'm like a member of a labor union, and sometimes we appeal to the National Labor Relations Board, right? And thank God, because they moderate how much the employer can run roughshod over the union, right? And so emotionally, and now of course I take your point, right? But emotionally, intuitively, it's no, that's the good thing that the state does, right? As opposed to all the things that we typically think of as wanting
in capitalism, yes, but in some ideal communist society, that's that was my point. But in capitalism, obviously, without the, but then again, I think the role of the state is multiply problematic, if I can put it that way, because even if you think about the welfare state and all the provisions of the welfare state and various things, it's sort of everything is put in such a way, that people are also discouraged from seeking their right, because you have to provide 100 million documents that, there is a constant joke, for example, from my native country, which is Bosnia, and people who were wounded during the war. So, for example, one of my neighbors has lost his arm, and he has to provide a paper each year that he lost his arm, as if he can grow his arm back. Yeah, yes. I mean, and similar things. So you have to provide a paper that you're in a wheelchair. So you have to provide a paper each year that you're in a wheelchair, and various other things. So state, yes, there is the positive side of the mediation, but there is on the other hand, state involvement can very much, and it is on the side of the capital. It's certainly not on the side of the workers. So it's a very complex, I think, conundrum of various elements and things. But obviously, if you're a member of a labor union, then you would tend to look at things a bit differently. But my point was more the ideal sort of communist society where this would not be needed.
Of course, I get it. And let me just say, as a matter of socialist strategy, especially in a country like the United States, it's very, very, very important and very tricky to defend the sort of limited, structures we have in place, like something like the National Labor Relations Board, but also not celebrate it too much, keeping in mind that everything is set up in order to maintain capitalist relations of production, because we're always, right, facing off against the extreme elements of the right, which want to they think end the Fed is like a revolutionary slogan, right? And so you'd want to be not too exuberant at the same time. Yeah, of course. Daniel.
I guess to me, I've always wondered if the issue of the withering of the state has to do with the withering of class relation and dominance of the bourgeoisie. Don't we need to invoke the question of the superstructure? And I know that Engels is criticized for relying on base superstructure, maybe dichotomies, and historical materialism definitely at times does that too. I'm just curious, isn't that the main issue? Which is how do you sustain the worker proletarian agitation after the expropriation, after the revolution? How do you think withering qua culture ideological wither of bourgeois, of the hegemony, of the power, of the logic of how to organize sociality? It's so deep, so thick. That's the the long negativity, the long negation, which has never really been mastered,
Right.
for many reasons. And obviously, Trotsky is, I think, huge there on his emphasis on permanent revolution. So anyways, there's much to be said, but I wonder if you all agree that the cultural, the ideological, these aspects of bourgeois ideology, which, going to Carol's point, I fear that we might think of withering as syndicalism. I'm not saying that you're suggesting that, but syndicalism still would retain bourgeois dominance at the level of the state. So we need to be careful there. It's very complicated. I'll stop.
Okay, and related to this, instead of having a good long response because I'd like to, but related to this, I wanted to bring up the other major flashpoint in part 3 related to the withering of the state, which is that this is supposed to be coterminous with a withering away of the division of labor. So there's this extended section which I had really brilliant things to say and I won't. But this extended discussion of the withering away of the division of labor between so-called white collar and blue collar labor, and manual labor and managerial labor, okay, and also rural and urban labor as well. And there seems to be these sort of polytechnic statements that Engels engages in, which is, instead of, as under capitalism, people are fractions of a machine, and therefore there's this reserve army of out-of-work people, and then underemployment or overwork for others who are brought in to do menial tasks and then thrown out once they're not useful. Instead, everyone can accommodate themselves polytechnically to different kinds of things, right? And I think this is sort of brilliant materialist insight, and also as a sort of curmudgeonly academic, like, makes me very grumpy, right? And I wonder how people are. So, like, I don't want to fucking do any plumbing at all. Like, I don't want to do any plumbing. I've tried to do plumbing. I failed. Like, I ruined the floors. Like, it was just like bad. And like, okay, granted, like, he's being smarter than like that everyone should do every single job. I get this. But he's saying something really radical. He's not merely saying the common sense, common socialist thing, which is like there needs to be sort of 2 years of service, so all the drudgery can be like shared evenly, and then everyone can follow their bliss. He's really saying that like people are going to do a whole lot of different jobs, rural and urban type jobs, technical and managerial and artistic type jobs. Like, he means it. If you read part 3, he means it like awfully literally. I was wondering, like, is that actually like a good thing? Is that desirable? Am I just too much a creature of late capitalism that, no, I want to write books and teach, like please leave me alone. Like, any thoughts about that? I genuinely want to know. I'm not making a polemic here. Like, what is the feeling? Am I just old? What's going on?
For example, if you can't do the plumbing, you can do the tiles, maybe. That's what he's saying, or something like that. But
like
obviously, yeah, maybe, but I don't think he wants to say that anyone could be a brain surgeon. I mean, there is some upper limit as to how much this division or non-division can go, because obviously, certain things, I mean, you wouldn't want your chef to open your heart and perform a surgery. So there has to be some sort of, I don't know what's the name or what the name would be, but, some sort of division there has to be, however awful. But the idea is that anyone can become a brain surgeon, which under capitalism is sold as a dream, whereas in reality, it's not quite possible, because we know, why and why this happens. But I think it's more in that direction.
Well, I'm glad you brought this up, Tiana, because but it relates to the other question about the withering away of the state, right? If not everyone can become a brain surgeon, what is the accountable democratic body, hopefully accountable and hopefully democratic, which decides who doesn't get, like they should tell me not to be a brain surgeon, right? Like, who tells me that? And I would hope it would be some generally accountable body and not some self-appointed private clique, right? So don't these things sort of go together, right? If you really want a withering away of the division of labor, but for there to be accountability and specialists, don't you need something like a state to tell people, like, yes or no? before they start cutting open bodies.
I think the question begs. I think the question begs for a state, first of all. Like, you're still in the mindset of, okay, who's going to tell me this? And the fact is that under communism or under a transition, that state's, that worker state's priorities and organization is going to be vastly different. And the idea that the transition has to be worked out beforehand because it never has before in a practical and realistic sense, I mean, it's sort of nonsensical. Like, the parameters for that transition do not exist yet because of who's in the driver's seat. If we take power, then you can set priorities. Before then, you're just daydreaming, you're spinning out utopian fantasies based on, you know, guesses at best. Okay. So when you're talking about how the state withers away, you're really talking about the needs that were like necessary under capitalism disappearing because the need disappeared. Like, you don't get rid of the people. Okay. You get, you know, the need disappears and then the people go and do something else because the need wasn't there to begin with. And this idea that culture is going to help do this, not just material reality. Well, that's true, but they work dialectically. You can't just see them as oppositional, or you're thinking in bourgeois terms, unfortunately. You're trying to force logic into the equation when the material conditions will create the culture, which will then redound on the material conditions and then create further degradations in culture, and the spiral will continue, I guess you could say.
I would just say this, whether we deign to use the word state or not, if we think there needs to be some kind of accountable body, some kind of meta body to decide, you know, how this division or the withering away of the division of labor actually operates, it might behoove socialists to care quite a bit about the ideals and structures in place by which we manage this kind of body, right? If this body is meant to manage the operation of society and the economy for human good, for human flourishing, for human consumption, I think it behooves us to care a lot about something like democracy, to care about how this body is so constituted so as to be able to manage competing claims within a society and for human good, but also not form its own independent power over that society.
How do we know it will be that deliberate is my question.
Sorry?
How do we know it will be that deliberate? There's a deliberacy that you're implying in there that's saying, well, there's got to be a ministry for something. There's got to be, you know, there's got to be one of the Russian words.
So not to give a weasel of an answer, but I'm writing something on this now, and I'm also simultaneously out of time. So I'll happily discuss this in the future, but I believe, Daniel, I'm 2 minutes over, right?
Yeah, I think we should probably wrap in a couple minutes, just because I know folks, it's dinner time in some parts of the country, and in other parts of the world, it's like 2 a.m.
It's ridiculous. Thank you for joining. I do appreciate it, and I appreciate the sort of robust back and forth, especially for those who are not on like the Eastern Standard Time, so-called. But absolutely, these are sort of live questions. The nature of this body, whether it's a deliberative body, to what degree it's separate from actual production. Okay, these are things I think which we need to take seriously. One, again, how I started off was, you know, one of the things that makes Anti-Duhring unique is that it does provide, in the sort of mature phase, a sort of worldview for Marxism, and it tips the hand a bit, right? Okay, in wanting to actually make claims about what a futurism will and won't look like, which Marx and Engels were famously reluctant to do, right? Not putting together recipe books for a future of socialism. Well, Anti-Duhring Part 3 goes a little bit in that direction. And I think, well, we don't want to end up as utopians, simply, right, spinning out of our own minds, you know, fanciful ideas about what the ideal society will look like. okay, no, if we don't do that at all, we don't have we don't have anything to sell people, right? Forgive the market jargon here, but you need something to aim for if you're going to convince people to join a movement or to join a cause or even to think seriously, to deliberate seriously with you. There has to be an idea that you're aiming at something that makes sense, and that's why these kinds of questions are absolutely apt. So I do thank you for them, and I'll come up with something more coherent to say moving forward.
Okay, everyone. Well, please express your gratitude to Dr. Fluss. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of Harrison. Sorry. I just interviewed both Landon and Harrison, his partner in crime, the Marxist Deleuze and Guattari, if you will. And yeah, but thank you so much, Landon, for these 3 sessions. We all benefited so much.
I was happy to do it. Thank you.
It was a blast, and everyone's super grateful. So we'll have to do it again.
Yeah.
With another Marxist text. So come at us with your ideas and come back and give us another seminar.
Anytime. I really appreciate it. I was honored to be able to do it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Bye.
See you.
See you soon, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.